Section 1 Introduction. After the Civil War, the future of the South was uncertain. How would these states be brought back into the Union? Would they be conquered territories or equal states? How would they rebuild their governments, economies, and social systems? What rights did freedom confer on formerly enslaved people? The answers to many of Reconstruction's questions hinged on the concepts of citizenship, equality, and the practicalities of freedom. Americans who lived through the era engaged in the most open and widespread discussions of citizenship since the nation's founding. Reconstruction was a moment of revolutionary possibility and violent backlash. African Americans and radical Republicans pushed the nation to finally realize the Declaration of Independence's promises that all men are created equal and have certain unalienable rights. White Democrats granted African Americans legal freedom, but little more. When Black Americans and their radical allies succeeded in securing citizenship for freed people, a new fight commenced to determine the legal, political, and social implications of American citizenship. Resistance continued, but white Americans lacked sufficient commitment to enforce the new laws. White supremacist terrorism and electioneering undermined and then overthrew Reconstruction. Limits on human freedom endured and would stand for nearly a century more. Section 2. Politics of Reconstruction. Reconstruction, the effort to restore Southern states to the Union and to redefine African Americans' place in American society, began before the Civil War ended. President Abraham Lincoln began planning for the reunification of the United States in the fall of 1863. With a sense that Union victory was imminent, and that he could turn the tide of the war by stoking Unionist support in the Confederate States, Lincoln issued a proclamation allowing Southerners to take an oath of allegiance. When just 10% of a state's voting population had taken such an oath, loyal Unionists could then establish governments. These so-called Lincoln governments sprang up in pockets of Union-controlled territory in the South, including parts of Louisiana, Tennessee, and Arkansas. Unsurprisingly, these were also the places that were exempted from the liberating effects of the Emancipation Proclamation. Initially proposed as a war aim, Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation committed the United States to the abolition of slavery. However, the proclamation freed enslaved people only in areas of rebellion and left more than 700,000 in bondage in Delaware, Kentucky, Maryland, and Missouri, as well as in Union-occupied areas of Louisiana, Tennessee, and Virginia. To cement the abolition of slavery, Congress passed the 13th Amendment on January 31, 1865. The amendment legally abolished slavery, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted. Section 2 of the amendment granted Congress the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. State ratification followed, and by the end of the year, the requisite 3/4 of the states had approved the amendment, and 4 million people were forever free from the slavery that had existed in North America for 250 years. Lincoln's policy was lenient, conservative, and short-lived. The political winds changed when John Wilkes Booth shot Lincoln on April 14, 1865, during a performance of Our American Cousin at Ford's Theater. Treated rapidly and with all possible care, Lincoln nevertheless succumbed to his wounds the following morning, leaving a somber pall over the North and especially among African Americans. The assassination of Abraham Lincoln propelled Vice President Andrew Johnson into the executive office in April 1865. Johnson, a states' rights, strict constructionist, and unapologetic racist from Tennessee, offered former Confederates in Southern states a quick restoration into the Union. His Reconstruction plan required provisional Southern governments to void their ordinances of secession, repudiate their Confederate debts, and ratify the 13th Amendment. On all other matters, the conventions could do what they wanted with no federal interference. He pardoned all Southerners engaged in the rebellion, with the exception of wealthy planters who possessed more than $20,000 in property. The Southern aristocracy would have to appeal to Johnson for individual pardons. In the meantime, Johnson hoped that a new class of Southerners would replace the extremely wealthy in leadership positions. Many Southern governments enacted legislation that reestablished antebellum power relationships, South Carolina and Mississippi passed laws known as Black Codes to regulate black behavior and impose social and economic control. Other states soon followed. These laws granted some rights to African Americans, like the right to own property, marry, and make contracts. But they also denied fundamental rights. White lawmakers forbade black men from serving on juries or in state militias, refused to recognize black testimony against white people, apprenticed orphan children to their former enslavers, and established severe vagrancy laws. Mississippi's vagrant law required all freed people to carry papers proving they had means of employment. If they had no proof, they could be arrested and fined. If they could not pay the fine, the sheriff had the right to hire out his prisoner to anyone willing to pay the tax. Similar ambiguous vagrancy laws throughout the South reasserted control over black labor in what one scholar has called slavery by another name. Black codes effectively criminalized black people's leisure, limited their mobility, and locked many into exploitative farming contracts. Attempts to restore the antebellum economic order largely succeeded. These laws and outrageous mob violence against black Southerners led Republicans to call for a more dramatic Reconstruction. So when Johnson announced that the Southern states had been restored, congressional Republicans refused to seat delegates from the newly reconstructed states. Republicans in Congress responded with a spate of legislation aimed at protecting freed people and restructuring political relations in the South. Many Republicans were keen to grant voting rights for freedmen in order to build a new, powerful voting bloc. Some Republicans, like U.S. Congressman Thaddeus Stevens, believed in racial equality, but the majority were motivated primarily by the interests of their political party. The only way to protect Republican interests in the South was to give the vote to the hundreds of thousands of black men. Republicans in Congress responded to the codes with the Civil Rights Act of 1866, the first federal attempt to constitutionally define all American-born residents, except Native peoples, as citizens. The law also prohibited any restriction of citizens' fundamental rights. The 14th Amendment developed concurrently with the Civil Rights Act to ensure its constitutionality. The House of Representatives approved the 14th Amendment on June 13, 1866. Section 1 granted citizenship and repealed the Supreme Court's infamous Dred Scott 1857 decision. Moreover, it ensured that state laws could not deny due process or discriminate against particular groups of people. The 14th Amendment signaled the federal government's willingness to enforce the Bill of Rights over the authority of the states. Because he did not believe African Americans deserved equal rights, President Johnson opposed the passage of the 14th Amendment and vetoed the Civil Rights Act. But after winning a two-thirds majority in the 1866 midterm elections, Republicans overrode the veto, and in 1867 they passed the first Reconstruction Act, dissolving state governments and dividing the South into 5 military districts. Under these new terms, states would have to ratify the 14th Amendment, write new constitutions enfranchising African Americans, and abolish repressive black codes before rejoining the Union. In the face of President Johnson's repeated obstructionism, the House of Representatives issued articles of impeachment against the president. Although Johnson narrowly escaped conviction in the Senate, Congress won the power to direct a new phase of Reconstruction. 6 weeks later, on July 9, 1868, the states ratified the 14th Amendment, guaranteeing birthright citizenship and equal protection of the laws. In the 1868 presidential election, former Union General Ulysses S. Grant ran on a platform that proclaimed, "Let us have peace," in which he promised to protect the new status quo. On the other hand, the Democratic candidate, Horatio Seymour, promised to repeal Reconstruction. Black Southern voters helped Grant win most of the former Confederacy. Scalawags and carpetbaggers also buttressed Republicans in the South. Scalawag was the derisive term used to describe white Republicans in the South, and carpetbaggers was the term for Northerners who traveled to the South during Reconstruction. But black voters formed the backbone of the Republican coalition in the South. Reconstruction brought the first moment of mass Democratic participation for African Americans. In 1860, only 5 states in the North allowed African Americans to vote on equal terms with whites. Yet, after 1867, when Congress ordered Southern states to eliminate racial discrimination in voting, African Americans began to win elections across the South. In a short time, the South was transformed from an all-white, pro-slavery, Democratic stronghold to a collection of Republican-led states with African Americans in positions of power for the first time in American history. Through the provisions of the Congressional Reconstruction Acts, Black men voted in large numbers and also served as delegates to the state constitutional conventions in 1868. Black Americans drew on the decades-long tradition of colored conventions to prepare for the moment, and Black delegates actively participated in revising state constitutions. One of the most significant accomplishments of these conventions was the establishment of a public school system. While public schools were virtually non-existent in the antebellum period, by the end of Reconstruction, every Southern state had established a public school system. Republican officials opened state institutions like mental asylums, hospitals, orphanages, and prisons to white and Black residents, though often on a segregated basis. They actively sought industrial development, northern investment, and internal improvements. African Americans served at every level of government during Reconstruction. At the federal level, Hiram Revels and Blanche K. Bruce were chosen as U.S. Senators from Mississippi. 14 men served in the House of Representatives. At least 270 other African American men served in patronage positions as postmasters, customs officials, assessors, and ambassadors. At the state level, more than 1,000 African American men held offices in the South. P.B.S. Pinchback served as Louisiana's governor for 34 days after the previous governor was suspended during impeachment proceedings, and was the only African American state governor until Virginia elected L. Douglas Wilder in 1989. Almost 800 African American men served as state legislators around the South, with African Americans at one time making up a majority in the South Carolina House of Representatives. African American office holders came from diverse backgrounds. Many had been born free or had gained their freedom before the Civil War. Many free African Americans, particularly those in South Carolina, Virginia, and Louisiana, were wealthy and well-educated, two facts that distinguish them from much of the white population both before and after the Civil War. Some, like Antoine Dubuclet of Louisiana and William Breedlove from Virginia, owned enslaved laborers before the Civil War. Others had helped enslaved people escape or taught them to read, like Georgia's James D. Porter. Most African American office holders, however, gained their freedom during the war. Among them were skilled craftsmen like Emmanuel Fortune, a shoemaker from Florida, ministers such as James D. Lynch from Mississippi, and teachers like William V. Turner from Alabama. Moving into political office was a natural continuation of the leadership roles they had held in their former communities. By the end of Reconstruction in 1877, more than 2,000 African American men had served in offices ranging from local levy commissioner to U.S. Senator. When the end of Reconstruction returned white Democrats to power in the South, all but a few African American office holders lost their positions. After Reconstruction, African Americans did not enter the political arena again in large numbers until well into the 20th century. Section 3. The meaning of Black Freedom Land was one of the major desires of the freed people. Frustrated by responsibility for the growing numbers of freed people following his troops, General William T. Sherman issued Special Field Order No. 15 in January 1865, in which land in Georgia and South Carolina was to be set aside as a homestead for them. Sherman lacked the authority to confiscate and distribute land, so this plan never fully took effect. One of the main purposes of the federal government's Reconstruction-era Freedmen's Bureau, however, was to redistribute land to formerly enslaved people that had been abandoned and confiscated by the federal government. Even these land grants were short-lived. In 1866, land that ex-Confederates had left behind was reinstated to them. Freed people's hopes of land reform were unceremoniously dashed as Freedmen's Bureau agents held meetings with them throughout the South, telling them the promise of land was not going to be honored and that instead they should plan to go back to work for their former enslaver as wage laborers. The policy reversal came as quite a shock. In one instance, Freedmen's Bureau Commissioner General Oliver O. Howard went to Edisto Island to inform the black population there of the policy change. The Black Commission's response was that we were promised homesteads by the government. You ask us to forgive the landowners of our island. The man who tied me to a tree and gave me 39 lashes and who stripped and flogged my mother and my sister, that man I cannot well forgive. Does it look as if he has forgiven me, seeing how he tries to keep me in a condition of helplessness? In working to ensure that crops would be harvested, agents sometimes coerced formerly enslaved people into signing contracts with their former enslavers. However, the Bureau also instituted courts where African Americans could seek redress if their employers were abusing them or not paying them. The last ember of hope for land redistribution was extinguished when Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner's proposed land reform bills were tabled in Congress. Radicalism had its limits, and the Republican Party's commitment to national economic stability eclipsed their interest in racial justice. White Republicans' waning commitments to both racial and economic justice were reflected in the rise and collapse of the Freedmen's Savings and Trust Company, also known as the Freedmen's Bank. The Freedmen's Bank was established on March 3, 1865, as a savings bank for persons heretofore held in slavery or their descendants. Founded by white abolitionist and minister John Alvord, the Freedmen's Bank represented Republicans' goals of helping formerly enslaved people develop habits of saving and thrift by encouraging them to open accounts, deposit their savings, and grow their wealth. At its height, the bank had over 70,000 depositors across 37 branches who had collectively deposited approximately $57 million in their bank accounts. The bank had a sprawling footprint, establishing branches in northern cities such as New York and Philadelphia, and in the former Confederate South in cities with large black populations such as Jacksonville, New Orleans, and St. Louis. Despite the bank's benevolent foundations of serving the nation's freed people, the white trustees had different goals. The trustees and administrators, a veritable who's who of white Republicans, began the practice of making illegal loans to themselves and their business partners. Once Congress approved of amending the bank's charter in 1870, allowing the trustees to operate the bank not as a savings bank but as a commercial bank, the trustees began allowing borrowers to receive loans. By the summer of 1874, the bank had approximately $3.5 million in outstanding loans, the vast majority of which was borrowed by white people who lived in and around Washington, D.C. Despite the bank's popularity both with black depositors and white borrowers, by early 1874 the bank was on the verge of collapse. The trustees then asked Frederick Douglass to be the bank's president mere months before Congress mandated that the bank cease operations. Douglass accepted the position in March 1874. When the bank ceased operations in July 1874, the 61,144 depositors still had $2.9 million left in their accounts. Though members of Congress held hearings and heard the testimonies of trustees and depositors, no one was held to account for the bank's failure. Freed people had no recourse and were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered trust. Another aspect of the pursuit of freedom was the reconstitution of families. Many freed people immediately left plantations in search of family members who had been sold away. Newspaper ads sought information about long-lost relatives. People placed these ads until the turn of the 20th century, demonstrating the enduring pursuit of family reunification. Freed people sought to gain control over their own children or other children who had been apprenticed to white masters, either during the war or as a result of the Black Codes. Above all, freed people wanted freedom to control their families. Many freed people rushed to solemnize unions with formal wedding ceremonies. Black people's desires to marry fit the government's goal to make free black men responsible for their own households and to prevent black women and children from becoming dependent on the government. Freed people placed a great emphasis on education for their children and themselves, and the Freedmen's Bureau helped establish schools across the South. For many, the ability to finally read the Bible for themselves induced work-weary men and women to spend all evening or Sunday attending night school or Sunday school classes. It was not uncommon to find a one-room school with more than 50 students ranging in age from 3 to 80. As Booker T. Washington famously described the situation, It was a whole race trying to go to school. Few were too young and none too old to make the attempt to learn. Many churches served as schoolhouses and as a result became central to the freedom struggle. Free and freed black Southerners carried well-formed political and organizational skills into freedom. They developed anti-racist politics and organizational skills through anti-slavery organizations turned church associations. Liberated from white-controlled churches, Black Americans remade their religious worlds according to their own social and spiritual desires. One of the more marked transformations that took place after emancipation was the proliferation of independent Black churches and church associations. In the 1930s, nearly 40% of 663 Black churches surveyed had their organizational roots in the post-emancipation era. Many independent Black churches emerged in the rural areas, and most of them had never been affiliated with white churches. Many of these independent churches were quickly organized into regional, state, and even national associations, often by brigades of free Black Northerners and Midwesterners who went to the South to help the freed people. Through associations like the Virginia Baptist State Convention and the Consolidated American Baptist Missionary Convention, Baptists became the fastest-growing post-emancipation denomination, building on their anti-slavery associational roots and carrying on the struggle for Black political participation. Tensions between Northerners and Southerners over styles of worship and educational requirements strained these associations. Southern, rural Black churches preferred worship services with more emphasis on inspired preaching, while urban Black Northerners favored more orderly worship and an educated ministry. Perhaps the most significant internal transformation in churches had to do with the role of women, a situation that eventually would lead to the development of independent women's conventions in Baptist, Methodist, and Pentecostal churches. Women like Nannie Helen Burroughs and Virginia Broughton, leaders of the Baptist Women's Convention, worked to protect Black women from sexual violence by white men. Black representatives repeatedly articulated this concern in state constitutional conventions early in the Reconstruction era. In churches, women continued to fight for equal treatment and access to the pulpit as preachers, even though they were already able to vote in church meetings. Black churches provided centralized leadership and organization in post-emancipation communities. Many political leaders and office holders were ministers. Churches were often the largest buildings in town and served as community centers. Access to pulpits and growing congregations provided a foundation for ministers' political leadership. Groups like the Union League, militias, and fraternal organizations all used the regalia, ritual, and even hymns of churches to inform and shape their practice. Black churches provided space for conflict over gender roles, cultural values, practices, norms, and political engagement. With the rise of Jim Crow, Black churches would enter a new phase of negotiating relationships within the community and the wider world.